Few will be surprised by the latest report from the International Atomic Energy Agency on Iran. It's finding that the Tehran regime has computer models that could only be used to develop a nuclear weapon has triggered a new wave of speculation on the prospects of an Israeli strike. But there may be other, more pressing concerns as US forces leave Iraq. Welcome to Agenda with George Friedman, and joining us also this week is a special guest, the writer and defense expert Robert Kaplan. The obvious question as we move to a point where Israeli bombers can fly in clear skies over Iraq, or soon will be able to be, is this high noon for Iran?
Not necessarily, because just the fact that they're moving closer to developing a weapons capacity for their nuclear material does not mean that they can miniaturize it, put it on a warhead, and send it somewhere. Could be a long ways away from that. Of course, it's a much more acute threat for Israel than it is for the United States. Then you also have to consider the possibility that so what if Iran has 3 or 4 nuclear weapons with no air defense system, relative to what the Americans can do? But what does that mean? Isn't the 100 nuclear weapons in Pakistan a much greater threat? Or would the Saudis respond by parking Pakistani nuclear weapons in Saudi Arabia and thereby fusing the South Asian and the greater Middle East crisis into one? There are a lot of questions out there, and they're going to continue to play out, but this is nothing particularly new at this point.
So, George, is all this talk of an Israeli strike, and we've had it before, just rhetoric?
We're at a critical point. And the critical point is not about nuclear weapons. We're at the critical point that the U.S. is completing its withdrawal from Iraq. And we've seen recently the arrests of Sunnis in Iraq by the Maliki government. The Iranians are increasing their power. The balance of power is shifting in the region. The United States and Israel both want the Iranians to pull back. And as has happened several times before, they increase the drumbeat over the threat of nuclear weapons in order to create a psychological situation where the Iranians can reconsider their position. The problem that you have here is that the Israelis really don't have the ability to carry out the kind of strikes we're talking about. They certainly have nuclear weapons if they want to use nuclear weapons, but some of these facilities are near Tehran, and that would be probably something the Israelis can't and won't do. The more interesting question is, do they have the ability to carry out the multi-day attacks on multiple sites with their relatively small air force and with their tanker capability? And the answer is they may, but they can't deal with something else. What if the Iranians respond by putting mines in the Straits of Hormuz?
And this is critical, isn't it? Because 40% of the world's seabound oil goes through the Straits of Hormuz.
And the Iranians have the longest coastline along the Straits of Hormuz, along the whole Persian Gulf for that matter. And the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, which is separate from the Iranian Navy, is developing a very impressive asymmetric warfare capability of suicide boats that can ram into merchant tankers to destroyers. And keep in mind, in this hothouse media environment where the world is all together, simply pinprick attacks on destroyers of other nations will garner incredible media news and will seem to be an attack on an American Navy that has been inviolate since World War II, in fact.
Well, and this is really crucial, that the psychological effect is substantial, but the effect on markets in this case is substantial. If the perception was that the Iranians had the ability to mine the straits or in some other way threaten these extremely expensive tankers with they're up to $1 billion, including their cargo, which have to be insured, and who are the insurance companies, if they could really threaten these, the price of oil would rise dramatically.
And stock markets would tumble.
And you are in a situation right now where Europe is in a major crisis. The financial system of the world is shaky. If you suddenly wound up with $200, $300, $400 barrel oil, you could reshape the global landscape dramatically.
And
Yeah, it
keep
wouldn't-
in
it-
mind,
it-
personalities enter into this a bit. Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel is, for years, decades in fact, universally seen as a very flawed personality in and of himself, regardless of whether you agree or disagree with his viewpoints. And as we enter into a presidential election season in the United States, where even someone like President Obama would be forced not to criticize Israel publicly, the Israelis thinking cynically, and all governments think cynically, you would say this is a window of opportunity for us to bomb Iran with fewer American domestic repercussions.
It may be, but it's very important that there's one domestic American repercussion. If the oil is cut off, the effect on the United States would be enormous, and Israel would be blamed for a massive recession or depression.
But as I was saying, Netanyahu has the kind of personality where he would risk that.
But this would be a catastrophe. But given the situation, which could evolve, we're not saying it will, but it could evolve with this second navy, as you describe it, in the Persian Gulf. Then what kind of advice is Obama's Defense Department giving him? And given that he's a man of great caution, I think, what do you expect him to be doing?
I think it's very clear what they're saying to him. Bluff.
Yeah.
And he's bluffing, and he is going out very publicly, which you don't do if you're planning a major attack, and very publicly bluffing, hoping the Iranians do what they've done in the past.
The U.S. Defense Department, I can tell you, does not have the appetite for a war with Iran. Remember, all Iranians, not just the regime, supports Iran being a nuclear power. In 10 years from now, we might have closer relations with Tehran than we have with Riyadh. The last thing we want to do is alienate even the Iranians who are sympathetic to us. Iran is a crucial country. It fronts not just the oil-rich Persian Gulf, but the oil-rich Caspian Sea. No other country does that. It has a window onto Central Asia, which no other country in the Middle East has. So it's enormously important. We're playing for high long-term stakes with Iran, which may be a future ally of the United States.
And we have to also recognize that with their increased power in Iraq, with the probability that the Assad regime in Syria, an Iranian ally, is going to survive, and with the presence of Hezbollah in Lebanon, you're looking at a situation where Iranian influence could stretch from the Afghan border to the Mediterranean. This is an enormously dangerous situation, and it's really not about nuclear weapons.
And Afghanistan to the Mediterranean approximate the Achaemenid Persia civil empire of antiquity, of a number of the Sassanid empire of the early medieval period. Because remember, Persia, Iran as a linguistic cultural force extends from Alawite Syria eastward right up to the Indus River in Pakistan.
Well, George and Robert, I'm afraid we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed. George Friedman and special guest Robert Kaplan ending agenda for this week. Until the next time, goodbye.